Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to Good Orderly Direction, Practical Tools of the Bible. Today we're talking about Numbers 25 through 29, the kingdom of God, recognizing a power greater than oneself. I'm your host, Dr. Donnelly Snipes. Continuing on the theme of unmanageable desires, while Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. Israel became yoked to their god, Baal, and the Lord's anger burned against them. At this point, unity of the nation was of paramount importance for survival of Israel, for survival of the kingdom of God. There were all these warring factions that wanted to overthrow them, and in order to survive, they needed to stick together. If the Israelite men became part of the Moabite culture, they may take their families and weaken the Israelite army, weaken the kingdom of God. Through good orderly direction from God, we can see that the Israelites were not strong enough to resist these temptations. And that's kind of what started leading to their downfall. Good orderly direction would have had somebody exercise prudence and recognize that people are starting to go astray, probably ought to do something, and take the steps needed and earnestly enforce the law. But that really wasn't done. So we start to see this gradual erosion. So apply this in your family. How have you seen people starting to erode away from the core, erode away from the heart of the community? In your family, sometimes we see this when children split parents. It's like, okay, well, I can't get mom to agree to anything, but dad's a real soft touch. So I can manipulate them and I can figure out how to pair one against the other. Well, that's not what God wanted. In your community, we see the same thing in that the Israelites saw when they were when they were around the Moabites. And it can be tempting for people to think, oh, that looks shinier, that looks newer, that looks more rewarding or more enticing. I'm going to go that way. And then you have other people who don't, but the community of the kingdom of God starts to weaken as it starts to lose influence and lose people. What influence or what effect does that have on the community when the people who share your values and your belief systems start to kind of drift away? In recovery, we see the same thing. We have not the kingdom of God, but we have a recovery community that is supportive of one another. And they follow good orderly direction in order to create a safe and loving community. And I think it's important that we recognize that God does not prohibit peaceful coexistence, but God requires, good orderly direction, requires self-awareness, boundaries, compassion, and prudence. So in recovery, for example, it's not forbidden to know people or to interact with people with different addictions or with different approaches to recovery. That's fine. But when you start hanging around them all the time, or a lot of the time, their values, their traditions, their ways may start to become appealing or at least curious to you. And that can be a danger. So it's important to recognize with whom it's safe to develop community versus just merely associate. And developing community with people who don't embrace the values and principles important to your survival. In recovery, this is a life or death thing for a lot of people. And if you start developing community, as I mentioned, with those who have a radically different approach to recovery and belief system, then it may put your own recovery at risk. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." 24,000 men were killed or excommunicated, likely killed that day, in order to prevent them from weakening the Israelite army, weakening the kingdom of God by leaving, and strengthening the Moabite community. So another census was taken in order to determine how much land was needed, how many Levites were needed, and to plan an effective tactical strategy. It was vital at this point, remember, to know how many men were available to serve in the army now that 24,000 had been killed. And that required some restructuring of the army and of the plan. God reminded Moses that he and Aaron had failed to ensure he was honored as holy, as such they could not enter the promised land. Notice that Moses made God really angry, and God perceived Moses' behaviors as disrespectful, definitely imprudent. But Moses stayed in charge even after the incident in the desert. That was the prudent thing to do. Moses was the one with the gifts, the knowledge, the skills, the tools to lead the people. However, it was also prudent for him not to enter the Holy Land, to serve as a stark lesson to the people that God's in charge and no one is above God's law. So Moses still had to keep doing the work, but he wasn't going to get the reward. After all this happened, Joshua was appointed to succeed Moses. In Numbers 28 and 29, there's a restatement of the offerings and the festivals. These rituals that keep getting restated. You may be like, didn't we already hear about this? Yeah, we did. But rituals are expectation, and expectations help bind a community together. And it's important to reiterate them and say, don't forget you need to do this. Don't forget you need to do that. Just like for a lot of us who are married, don't forget your anniversary. You need to celebrate that to remind yourself of your gratitude. Remind yourself of why you're together. Religious festivals served as a mandatory period of rest and restoration for not only the body, but also the soul and the community. There was relationship building and meditation to reflect on the glory of God and good orderly direction and increase gratitude.